The Electoral College is a bad and antiquated system, and I'm going to tell you why all the most common arguments its defenders use to justify its continued existence are wrong. It doesn't really encourage candidates to engage with or campaign in small states or rural areas. It doesn't preserve election integrity, and it does not encourage moderation or coalition building. I'll tell you why. First, what is the Electoral College? The Electoral College is the body of people who actually decides who gets to be president. It's made up of electors. Each state is assigned a number of electors based on the size of their congressional delegation. So, for example, my home state of Texas has 40 electors because we have 38 representatives in the House of Representatives and 2 senators. There are 538 electors in total, and a candidate must win 270 of those votes in order to actually become president. State legislatures determine how electors are assigned, so theoretically they could do it however they want. But with the exceptions of Maine and Nebraska, the rest of the country uses winner-take-all elections to determine which candidate receives their electoral votes. That means that the candidate with the most votes within the borders of that state or the District of Columbia receives all the Electoral College votes for that state, or DC, regardless of how close it was. If this seems complicated to you, that's because compared to how we do basically every other election in this country, it absolutely is complicated. For example, when you vote for your U.S. representative, there's no electoral college made up of delegates from every county in the district. We just count the votes. So let's go through the arguments for this peculiar little system we have for electing our president, and I'll tell you why I have a problem with them, and then at the end I'll tell you the one argument for the Electoral College that I think is the most reasonable out of the bunch. First, let's address one of the most common myths about the Electoral College, that it somehow forces candidates to campaign in or pay attention to rural areas and low population states in order to win the presidential election.
You cannot win 270 electoral votes if only one part of the country is supporting you. But if winning were only about getting the most votes, a candidate might concentrate all of his efforts in the biggest cities or the biggest states. Why would that candidate care about what people in West Virginia or Iowa or Montana think?
From a superficial perspective, this seems obviously true, right? After all, the Electoral College does guarantee that even the smallest state will have at least 3 electoral votes. However, when we look at actual data showing how often presidential candidates visit each state, it's a completely different story. This is data from 2020 showing where Donald Trump and Joe Biden decided to spend their time on the campaign trail holding events. And what do we notice? More than half the states were not visited even once by either of the presidential candidates, and the states that were not visited at all are disproportionately likely to be low population. Only a handful of states in the bottom 25 states by population were visited even once by either presidential candidate. Obviously, physical campaigning isn't the only way to reach voters, so let's take a look at ad spending. How much were Biden and Trump spending in each state to reach voters? What do you know? It's the exact same pattern. Now, how is this possible? It's possible because the idea that the Electoral College encourages candidates to reach out to rural or low population states is a complete myth. The only thing that matters for presidential campaigns is how possible it is to win your state. In other words, if you live in a swing state, candidates will shower your state with rallies and ad spending. They will cater their policies to you. They will performatively engage with your local institutions and culture. They will make you feel like your voice is being heard. And if you do not live in a swing state, they won't do any of those things. We know this, I think, intuitively. Did you know that in 2020, more people voted for Donald Trump in California than in any other state? Maybe not, because the Electoral College says it literally does not matter. Those people, as far as the presidential election is concerned, may as well have not voted. Candidates know that victory in the Electoral College is determined by about 50,000 people in the handful of states that just happen to be competitive. In principle, there is actually absolutely nothing stopping the largest state in the country from being a swing state and therefore by far the most important state in the presidential election. For a big chunk of American history, actually, that was exactly how it was with the state of New York. Texas is home to some of the largest metropolitan areas in the country, and if it ever becomes winnable for Democrats, you better believe that's where campaigning will be happening. It's worth more in the Electoral College than Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania combined. A competitive Texas would be a total knockout punch for Democrats and an absolute must-win for Republicans, and it's only getting more competitive as it continues to grow in population. Looking at the history of why we have the Electoral College at all, it's actually completely obvious why the myth of the Electoral College encouraging candidates to campaign in low population states is just incorrect. James Madison, the father of the Constitution, laid out the situation at the time pretty plainly. There was one difficulty, however, of a serious nature attending an immediate choice by the people, meaning a popular vote. the right of suffrage was much more diffusive in the northern than the southern states. Now, obviously, small states benefited some from the Electoral College, absolutely, but they were never the biggest beneficiaries. The existence of the Senate was their biggest get. If you went to school in the United States, you might remember this from your American history class during the section on the New Jersey and Virginia plans for the U.S. Constitution. The Electoral College was supported by some delegates for fears of popular democracy or the side benefits it would provide for small states, but what made the Electoral College absolutely necessary was that it roughly balanced power between free and slave states when it came to the national election. Because enslaved people were counted as 3/5 of a person for the purposes of apportionment of representatives and obviously could not vote, and the number of electors given to each state is determined by representation in Congress, the Electoral College gave slave states a way to ensure that the presidential election would not be dominated by free states. All this becomes obvious when we look at which state benefited the most from the Electoral College at the time of its inception, the state of Virginia, which in 1790 was the most populous state, and its electoral influence was expanded even further by the fact that the 3/5 compromise granted Virginia more electors. So, in short, why doesn't the Electoral College actually encourage campaigning in low population states? Well, because that's just not what it was for. Some supported the Electoral College because it guaranteed small states at least 3 electors, but it was designed at a time when it was necessary to bring a country divided over an evil institution together, and it did this by giving slave states like Virginia a way to leverage the 3/5 compromise into roughly even influence with the free states in the presidential election. But if we moved away from winner-take-all elections or the Electoral College altogether, wouldn't candidates just abandon small states completely? Doesn't this side benefit count for something? No. In fact, the only low population non-swing states that even received visits by Biden or Trump in 2020 are Nebraska and Maine. These are also the only 2 states that have moved away from awarding electors by winner-take-all vote and instead allocate 1 elector to the winner of each of their congressional districts and 1 elector to the statewide winner. This system has its own problems, namely adding gerrymandering as a factor in presidential contests, but if you're a citizen of a low population state or a state that isn't a swing state, and you want candidates to not ignore you without throwing out the Electoral College altogether, this is one path you can take, but it requires allocating electors on a more representative basis. However, as it stands, if you do not live in a swing state, and especially if you live in a low population non-swing state that doesn't have the population to be leveraged for something like fundraising, the truth is that the existence of the Electoral College combined with winner-take-all elections means candidates do not have to care about you. Now, election integrity is a hot topic, and I'm sure that's why PragerU decided to mention it in their video, so let's take a look at their argument.
The Electoral College also makes it harder to steal elections. Votes must be stolen in the right state in order to change the outcome of the Electoral College. With so many swing states, this is hard to predict and hard to do. But without the Electoral College, any vote stolen in any precinct in the country could affect the national outcome, even if that vote was easily stolen in the bluest California precinct or the reddest Texas one.
So, does it make sense that the Electoral College makes elections harder to steal? Absolutely not. Let's set aside the fact that there just isn't evidence of widespread voter fraud in US presidential elections. If anything, dividing the presidential election into a bunch of smaller elections actually makes the presidential election easier to influence because it's easier to do small-scale fraud involving a couple thousand votes than large-scale fraud involving millions of votes. The popular vote margin between Joe Biden and Donald Trump in 2020 was more than 7 million votes. It was a win, but it wasn't a blowout. Even still, it would have taken a conspiracy of massive proportions in order to overturn that margin in the popular vote. When you're talking about a conspiracy, everything becomes so much harder the more people you have to involve. A conspiracy to overturn just tens of thousands of votes is small potatoes compared to 7 million. This is why most voter fraud, when it's discovered to have actually impacted the results of an election, occurs at the local level. Everything about it becomes easier with smaller numbers and fewer variables. And it doesn't even matter that you can't predict exactly which swing states are going to go which way, because you know which states are going to be swing states ahead of time, and you know how many of them you can afford to lose and still win the election. So our hypothetical conspirators wouldn't even need to defraud every swing state, just enough to win. Additionally, PragerU seems to imply that fraudsters could somehow steal the election by running up the score in just a few precincts, and This is just obviously ridiculous. If you're trying to steal an election and you're actually trying to succeed at stealing an election, you can't just give a Democrat dictator margins in California or something. That would be so obvious. You need to have a massive distributed operation. If you actually wanted to succeed, you'd need to make it look like just a few precincts suddenly lurched in one direction in defiance of all polling, population data, and historical trends. I've avoided mentioning this until now, but if you ever wanted evidence that the Electoral College actually makes matters worse for election integrity by creating margins small enough that they can be more easily fudged, just take it from Donald Trump. Here's what he wanted from the Georgia Secretary of State.
Look, all I want to do is this. I just want to find 11,780 votes, which is one more than we have, because we won the state.
Now, he failed, but, it would have been a lot harder to find 7 million votes is all I'm saying. Finally, let's talk about moderation and coalition building. Does the Electoral College encourage moderation and coalition building in a way that a national popular vote or some other more directly representative system cannot? I don't believe that makes sense. In terms of the Electoral College encouraging candidates to build broad geographic coalitions, this does seem superficially true. It is impossible to win the Electoral College by focusing only on one region of the country, at least if you define regions narrowly enough. But isn't this a pretty impoverished definition of a diverse coalition? Who cares if the census says that these states are in different regions, if the system of the Electoral College technically allows a candidate to win by winning only 12 states and less than 30% of voters? An eventuality like this would just never be possible with a system that more directly represented the will of the people. You would never be able to win without winning the most votes. Or if we wanted to protect against plurality winners, someone winning without winning more than 50% of the vote, we could just have a runoff. Or we could even have an instant runoff made possible by ranking your choices for president when you cast your vote. I also feel like this argument, again, really ignores much of American history where regionalist concerns played a much more significant role in politics than they do today. The Electoral College didn't do anything to help out there. In terms of moderation, again, I just really don't understand where this argument's coming from. It's a perennial problem in American politics where something will pull very well with, the average voter, the median voter, but pulls very poorly in a swing state, and candidates have to ignore what most Americans want in favor of a minority opinion that's nonetheless influential in a must-win state. It seems to me that a definition of moderation that amounts to whatever the people in the swing states want rather than what the average American wants, what most Americans want, is a recipe for less moderation, not more. Yes, swing states can and do change, but also why should that mean a thing? Why should my voice and my state's concerns be more or less important based on the partisan balance of my state? Taking turns on who's currently being ignored doesn't magically make being ignored on that basis more reasonable or fair. The Electoral College defender needs to make a positive case for why it is good for some people's votes to be worth more than others. Because, as much as they like to keep that out of the conversation, the practical effect of the Electoral College is that some people's votes are more important than others. One person, one vote is a good principle to have because it doesn't require some ad hoc justification for why a person in Michigan is worth listening to and a person in Louisiana is not. So let me change directions for just a second and ask something. Why do we have physical meetings of electors at all? Why not just do things automatically? Once the vote totals in each state come in, just have those results certified by Congress. Seems like that would be a quicker, easier, less dramatic version of what we have now, and we'd still have the alleged benefits without all the trouble of physical people being involved. Well, this leads me to what I think is basically the only argument in favor of the Electoral College that seems to logically follow from both its history and how it functions, which is that electors have the authority to be faithless. They have the authority to not vote for who they're pledged to vote for. This is really the part of the Electoral College that's doing the preventing the tyranny of the majority bit, if we're being honest. The argument's pretty straightforward. If the people vote for someone who is clearly unfit, this kind of pseudo-aristocratic body called the Electoral College provides a mechanism to ignore this choice and pick someone else instead. In my opinion, if you're a defender of the Electoral College, this is your best argument out of all the most common ones. However, it does come with its own problems, including the fact that most Americans would view an election won this way as a stolen election. So if that kind of risk, combined with all the other problems that the Electoral College has, is worth it to you, then by all means, keep doing what you're doing and support it. I think at a bare minimum, the Electoral College system needs serious reform. We elect the president all together as Americans. It's the only office like that. I just don't believe that it should be the case that your vote matters more or less depending on who your neighbors vote for. So I'd very much like to eventually move toward a system where the Electoral College votes are awarded more proportionally. So like if you win 60% of the vote in a state, you get 60% of that state's electors, or just some form of straight national popular vote for president. I think either would be better than what we currently have in all of its brokenness. I think it really could be better, and I hope one day it really will be. All right, thanks for watching. I know this isn't a new topic or anything, but I wanted to throw my 2 cents in since, it's an election year. Leave me a comment telling me I'm an evil communist if you disagreed with me, and leave me a comment telling me I'm a brave patriot if you did agree. Okay, like, subscribe. That's it. See you next time.